Parables. We talked last week about a really weird parable. This week, we're talking about another troubling parable. But again, parables are meant to be troubling. They're meant to make us have to reimagine our understanding of the world, or to give us cautionary tales. Well, I must admit, this particular passage has been perhaps misinterpreted many ways throughout Christian history. The most common being the idea that the rich man represents Judaism or the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and Lazarus represents the followers of Jesus, particularly the Gentile converts who replaced the Jews in terms of being in the bosom of Father Abraham. That is patently false. Both of these individuals are Jews. So let's take that supersessionist stuff out of the way. And let's unpack it, shall we? So, the rich man, we don't get his name, but we get descriptions of him and his lifestyle. Now, we might take for granted that Marietta and Jonathan are both wearing purple today, and that it's not any more or less expensive than any other color of linen that we have. In the first century, on the other hand, that was not true. Purple was the most expensive dye you could get. That's why royalty wore it. So this guy wears a cloak of purple. So we're talking, he's down on Fifth Avenue or in Walnut Creek shopping at the fanciest, most, expensive stores you can get. Even more weird is that his undergarments are described as fine linen. So we're talking, silk underlayers. I'll leave it at that. This guy spared no expense to enjoy himself. And then, every day, this man feasts sumptuously. He celebrates. He has a party. Maybe he doesn't have a lot of people there, but he has the best. So we're talking, if I had my fantasy of this, Glenn would cook a steak dinner every night, and I would just enjoy that, have a $300 bottle of a bold red to go with that. And I would have a wonderful time with that. Until I had my cardiac arrest and died. But never mind my health. Never mind the cows that I would be consuming on way too rapid a basis. And never mind the people that I might need to help out with that kind of money. So, who's liking this guy already? Yeah. Okay. So we're talking, this guy wants to prove to the world just how rich he is. At his gate, to his place, so we're talking a gated community as well, so he has a really nice house. There's this man, Lazarus, who is a beggar. Or not even, actually, no, he's not a beggar. He's a poor man. He's beyond begging, because begging at least is kind of a job. This man has illnesses like Job, where he has sores all over his body that dogs would come and lick. Now, ew is the first thought. And let's face it, that's a valid response. But what's interesting is that he is not unclean ritually, because he's not a leper. His sores are gross, but they're not unclean. But the neat thing is the dogs licking the wounds are actually helping kind of soothe and heal his body, because dog's saliva is cleaner than the insides of our mouths. Well done, Heidi. There you go. So, obviously we have quite a chasm here. So, moving forward, Lazarus dies, goes to the bosom of Abraham. He's in the body of all of the family of God. This is promised to all under the Torah. Well, the rich man goes to Hades, the underworld, and ends up being tormented. Now, one might be inclined to feel pity for this man. And I think that's not a bad idea. He was not the best guy in the world, but who wants to be tormented forever? And who really wants people to be tormented forever? Tormented for 100 years? Sure. Learn your lesson. Get your act together and go start again. but forever? Forever, ever? But let's unpack that a little bit too. In the first century, a common understanding was the works that you do in your life store up the consequences of your life in the life to come. So if you're constantly doing good works, you're storing up treasures in heaven. Or if you are suffering, you are storing up treasures in heaven, where rust doesn't corrupt or moth destroy. But blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, but woe to the rich, for they have received their consolation. So this rich guy, he had all the good things in this life, and in the next life, he stored up for himself nothing. Not only because he had all the good things, but he withheld the good things from others in need. So even though it's a painful truth in the story, he knew what he was doing. Because later on, you talk about, Abraham tells him, you had Moses and the prophets. So you know what you're doing, and you knowingly, willingly don't do it. But let's look again at his personality, even in Hades. So this guy is tormented, realizing, this is not good. He says, Father Abraham. Abraham was said to be one who was part of the guardian of the afterlife in the first century. Lots of interesting stuff is swirling around Abraham that isn't in the Torah. And what does he say? He says, send Lazarus to dip his finger in water to touch my mouth because I am in agony here. Even in Hades, this guy thinks that Lazarus serves no purpose whatsoever than to be a servant to him. Abraham's like, nope, for two reasons. Number one, I can't. The chasm is so great between us that there is no way I could cross that divide even if I wanted to. But notice that he calls him child, a term of affection and endearment. He is still a son of Abraham, just like Lazarus. And he says, can you send him to my brothers so that they can hear from him and be changed so that they don't end up here? Abraham says, no. They have Moses and the prophets. They have the sacred scriptures. They have the Torah. Let them listen to them. And he says, no. No, see, if you send someone from the dead, they'll believe. Now, most of us think that sending Lazarus back from the dead to the brothers would be an unusual occurrence, but not in the ancient world. Ghosts coming back to give premonitions or give messages, even as far back as Saul searching for the necromancer in Endor, and believe it or not, that was way before Star Wars, brought Samuel back from the dead, and Samuel's like, what are you doing? This is stupid, and you just sinned against God in a grievous way. So he's thinking that having Lazarus come back from the dead to warn his brothers is a more powerful statement than the entirety of the law of Moses and the prophets. And Abraham says, look, if they didn't believe Moses and the prophets, a ghost isn't going to make a difference. Because it isn't really about the truth or untruth of the matter. It's whether or not they were willing to listen to what they needed to hear, whether it be from a supernatural source or a natural source. You guys with me on this? This is a very, very sobering tale. So nowadays, I won't mention any names, but there is a particular former sports celebrity who is in hot water with several high-ranking government officials because he had promised to fund the building of a stadium, and instead of paying that money, tried to embezzle money from the government, from the federal government, and most importantly, tried to pull millions of dollars from funds that were set aside for welfare and care for the poor. True story happening right now. Talk about the rich man. And yet, plenty of poor people are suffering. I mean, in one of the major cities, the capital city of this place, They don't have potable water because their infrastructure has collapsed, and so their water lines aren't working. Kind of a similar story. Both parties in this are Americans. They're tax-paying Americans that the government is set up to care for. So the story is very similar. Now it gets even more interesting. It's very easy to point the finger and go, "Ooh, I'm so glad I'm not that person." We end up sounding like the Pharisee that Jesus criticized for saying, "Thank you, God, that I'm not like these sinners." And it's hard to relate to that person because they're so heinous. It's like, wow, how could you be this way? Has anyone here been a beggar, or even worse, someone on the street so ill that you can't even take care of yourself, being walked past by obscenely wealthy people who don't even care about your plight? No. Bless your name. So what is the common thread in all of this? We know the Torah and the prophets. And what is the basic summation, as I'd say in every sermon, of the law and the prophets according to Jesus? Love your neighbor, love God, love yourself. So in this scenario, whether you believe in the particular understanding of the afterlife that this parable tells or not, everything in this life and in the life to come is summed up in how we care for one another. It isn't just knowing or believing, it's doing. So the rich man is a delightful caricature of the worst excesses of people who are selfish and greedy and uncaring about their neighbors. Lazarus, which is interesting, notice that the rich man is never named, but Lazarus is. We're supposed to care more for Lazarus in the story. I like the fact that both people have things to teach us about how we, who are in neither side of that spectrum, find that middle ground to make sure that we are following through with that way of living. So that regardless of who one is, we are caring for one another. And if we are people who find ourselves closer to the ledge of the rich man, instead of worrying about your brother's plight in terms of letting them know what's going on, worry about how your brothers can listen to Moses and the prophets so that they can go and care for the people that the rich man did not care for in his life. It's more than just knowing that you need to be better. It's figuring out how to better set up a world where that care is much more readily available, much better funded, and people are much better cared for. And we understand that we have a responsibility for one another in the world. Rich, poor, male, female, doesn't matter. So wherever you find yourself in the squirminess of this tale, and I find myself in that too, because it's a delicate balance. How many times have I walked past someone on the street in need? Quite a few. How many times have I helped people on the street in need? Quite a few. To what extent do I bankrupt myself to help people in the streets? To what extent do I try to make sure that I have enough to live comfortably so that I'm able to better serve people? There is no easy answer to this question, and that's the gift of parables. But the point is, we are commanded by God through God's way of being in the world, God's rule of life, God's law, that we need to pay attention to one another and care for one another. And we should live our lives and conduct our lives in such a way to best set up in our own ways the possibility that everyone that is a child of God, which is everyone, is in some way cared for. Will we achieve that in this life? No, never. Can we strive to get closer to it? Absolutely. And so one of the questions that we have to ask as St. Anne's is not just what is the purpose of St. Anne's for us, but what is the necessity of St. Anne's for Fremont, for Union City, for Newark, for Hayward, for Walnut Creek, in fact. That is the requirement that God asks of us, that we make sure that we know our necessity, however small we may be. We are necessary for our community. So may we remind ourselves to care for all, including those who may not be quite aware of how much they need to change so that they can be able to take better care of their neighbors. May we pay attention to the Lazaruses in our lives. May we pay attention to where we might be the rich man to some degree, and balance those things out to where God's shalom, wholeness, peace, and life are found here on earth. Amen.